I was at a training and the facilitator was asking or like sharing about, I think they're called stress punishment. And she assumed I would know what that means. And she literally called me out in the midst of that whole group. I was like, oh, you would know what I'm talking about.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Listen In podcast. My name's Aravana.
My name is Anya.
And my name's Boomy.
Let's get into it.
On today's episode, we'll be taking another look at identity, but we'll be specifically talking about lots of different topics, such as that experience of being an insider, but also an outsider at the same time. We hope you enjoy it. So there's a podcast that I listen to that I really like. It's called Rough Translations. It's an NPR podcast, and they were talking about, they're doing a whole series about identity, and obviously we've talked about identity as well last season, but it was really interesting because they had lots of different people from around the world talking about their identity and how other people identified them as well, and the mismatch between that sometimes. And it just reminded me a lot about some of the conversations that we've had with each other about, you know, how much we represent our cultures or not, and how other people see us in a certain way. Just wanted to kind of talk about that a bit more today, especially thinking about it in like a professional context as well.
So do you want to talk a bit more about that now and share kind of what your main kind of takeaway points were?
It wasn't really a takeaway. It was more of a resonance. Do you know what I mean? It was more of like, just because I think that sometimes when you feel something or experience something, you always think that it's you. But then when you hear other people saying it just, you can just relate to it. So what was really funny is that obviously, like, I feel like I've said this 10 million times, but obviously born in the UK, you know, lived in Ghana here and there, and obviously defining your identity or saying what your identity is, or even your culture and things like that is so multifaceted. So if I'm filling in a form, you know, there's certain boxes that I tick, but if I'm describing myself to somebody, depending on who I'm talking to and depending on the situation and depending on when you talk to me, it's different things, right? So like I've said before, for the longest time, I always used to say I'm Ghanaian first, but that's kind of evolved for various reasons. And sometimes I just call myself a citizen of the world. I just do. And what was really weird is that in that podcast, somebody said, I just call myself a citizen of the world. And I was like, what? I thought I made that up. But I get what he means, because it gets complicated, especially if you've been or lived in more than one place, and more than two places, sorry. If it's two places, then it's a bit more, I don't know, maybe it's not, but it can feel a bit more clear cut. Or if you've maybe lived in one place, but let's say if I'd never lived in Ghana, but my parents were from Ghana, then I feel like I could more easily say my parents are from Ghana. I never say that though. And when I feel like when someone says that to me, it has a different meaning for me. I don't know if that's what they mean, but I interpret that a different way. So it's just all these really, like, I think, you know, like they talk about ethnic minorities and stuff like that, but actually there's so many levels to it. It is a complex web, and it's so individual. And I think that sometimes, like, you know, like they'll say, oh, like you'll be able to relate to this because you're from Ghana, and it's like, yes, but also no. And also on the Ghanaian side, they're going to say no as well to me in some things. and yes to me in some things as well.
Mm.
And then we haven't even gone into the whole education, class, life experience, like all of those things, all of those layers on top. So we'll just stick to like cultural stuff for today, but it is really, really complicated, and you simplify it because that's life and you need to just have boxes to get on with things. But it's actually really, when you think about it, it's a lot to sort of bear in mind.
Mm.
But yeah, what do you guys think? Does that sort of like, do you feel like that at all? Or
I think it's quite difficult for me to say that I completely resonate with all of that, just purely because I'm one of those people who say that my parents are from somewhere. And my parents are from Jamaica, for example, because I was born here, but then I still find that I associate myself with the culture a lot as well, with the Jamaican culture a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then even when it comes to like filling out forms and they ask where you're from, it's like Black, British, Caribbean. That's my ethnicity. I don't feel like it's just British or just, I think it's the Caribbean influence is very strong as well. And that is part of my roots. So yeah.
That's really interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you ask different people and you get very, very different responses as well, isn't it? Yeah, I can definitely resonate with some of you both. But I think one of the things I like about this podcast is because we have like there are huge differences between us, but also some really subtle differences, and it just makes it an interesting picture. Like for me, I was raised in Nigeria. So until the age of about 15, 16, I keep meaning to actually check the date, but like I've stopped calculating now because it's been a little while. But at least at this point, it feels like I've lived like half and half of my life in Nigeria and here. And so there's certain things that obviously I have still have really strong ties with the Nigerian culture. But actually like if I think about myself and obviously Nigeria as a whole, and this is why I feel like there's so many layers to these things, like even in the culture side of things, without thinking about age, like the demographics and everything else that like makes up a people, or like a sense of identity really, that actually when you think about the Nigerian culture, I can't say that there is a specific Nigerian culture, even though like to outsiders it might feel like there is a Nigerian culture, because you say you're Nigerian and people automatically assume, well, you must know how that person is, but that person would be very, very different from me. Like even though I'm Yoruba, my ethnic group is Yoruba, even with that there's so many different dialects, so many different cultures, there's just so many different things that makes up a people. I mean, they say that there's at least 300 languages in Nigeria and over 500 dialects. So, and you can imagine how many cultures would be within all of that. So when people assume that I should know certain thing about someone just because we're from Nigeria, it doesn't make sense. And even when someone also assumes that I should know something about someone because we're both Yoruba, on a level, yes, I might. On another level, it'll be very, very different because of their cultural background as well. So, yeah, I don't feel like I can speak to certain things, but I just can't I can't be the spokesperson for my community in a sense, just based on that. And that's like keeping it very broad,
real,
and simple. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And do you think that people put that pressure on you to be the spokesperson?
It can feel like that sometimes. I mean, sometimes you get like both at work and outside of work that you get people ask you certain questions, and even you're taking a back break because you're like, I can't answer that. I have no idea what you're talking about. And so sometimes, or like when people, like even something as simple as a name, that I'd have people come up to me and say, how do you pronounce that name? I'm like, I'm as clueless as you are. Or like even a really like a really it wasn't an experience I was pleased with, but it just goes to show. I was at a training, and I've shared with you both, I'm sure. I don't know if I've shared it on what any of our episodes before, so pardon me listeners if it's a repeat. But I was at a training, and facilitator was asking or like sharing about, I think they're called stress punishment. And she assumed I would know what that means. And she literally called me out in the midst of that whole group. I was like, oh, you would know what I'm talking about. First off, I wasn't the only Black person in the room. So I have no idea why she thinks I would know. But she called me out. And it's just like, people just expect you to know things or like be aware of things. On one hand, sometimes you do feel bad for not knowing those things. On another hand, you're like, well, hopefully other people learn that just because I'm part of that culture doesn't mean I would always know. And another thing to say actually is the fact that I haven't lived in Nigeria for so long. Things have changed. Culture is not static. Culture evolves over time. So like, even though I lived in Nigeria when I was younger, when I go back, there are certain places I go that I'm still made to feel like an outsider.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is, I've forgotten the proper term for it, but obviously it's that thing of when you go to another place, you do start, most of the time you do start to take on that culture as well. So even if your culture is very strong, there's bits of the dominant culture that you're in that you're going to start assimilating to. So then it makes it quite, and also when you've been educated in these systems as well, sometimes you can just have a very Western way of thinking where it gets to a point where in some ways you're kind of no longer able to relate to the people from your culture, because your way of thinking about it is now different to how they think about it. So you end up saying the same because you've been trained on this is how we think about these things, where you actually now can't see another side to the way that they're thinking about a certain situation, you know, like culturally. So it's something that's you know, quite complicated. But saying that, I think broadly speaking, a lot of times you do know, like there is, it's a funny thing because it's always really, that conversation is awkward. Like, you know what that lady said to you, like, you know what I'm talking about. And I remember when you told me that story, I was like, why is she assuming that you know what she's talking about? But also, I do know what she's talking about at the same time.
Exactly.
But why are you assuming that I know what you're talking about?
Exactly. That was my problem, because I knew what she was talking about, but I was just calling it. I was like, why do you assume I know?
You did know.
I did know. I definitely knew what she was like. That was my experience as a young one, but she didn't know any of that about me. So why would she make that assumption? I probably just look like someone who's been stress punished my life.
Sometimes it's just the principle. You're like, no, don't make assumptions, but actually I do know. But yeah, like in some ways I feel like most of the time, broadly speaking, generally speaking, yes, like we are representative of our communities to a certain degree, but we're also, like we've been saying, we're insiders, but we're also outsiders. So we are an inside to both sides. We're insiders in terms of the clinical side and cultural side, but sometimes the people that you're working with see you as an outsider. So for example, if I'm working with someone that's like recently come from Ghana, and they perceive me, they know from my accent, they know from my name that I'm Ghanaian, but they know, like they can hear my accent, so they know that I've grown up here. So actually sometimes the way they perceive me is I'm not Ghanaian. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes they do see me, or they see me as a certain type of Ghanaian, like one of those Ghanaians that have grown up here, whatever, whatever comes with that. So sometimes it's helped. I would say majority of the time, 99.9% of the time, when I've had people who are West African, sometimes you can see that they just like, they'll say to me like, oh, what's your name? And then I'll tell them my name. They're like, oh, where's that from? And I'll say Ghana. They'll be like, oh, I'm from, I don't know, Botswana or something. So then you have something in common. So then it just makes them feel a bit more at ease. And then you can have like very, very generalized conversations about Africans, culture and stuff, which we all know we're generalizing, but you know, we understand each other. But then sometimes there's there's a few situations where it's the opposite effect, where sometimes they actually don't want to be talking to a fellow Ghanaian or someone who does know the culture or anything. Sometimes they want someone, it's not as usual, but I found that where sometimes they don't want to talk to me, they want to talk to someone else for different reasons. It could be personality as well. I'm not, you know, I can't deny that. But I think sometimes there is that, I don't know, I get that feeling, that impression. But most of the time it is extremely helpful, and sometimes we can have conversations where I don't know if those conversations will come up with somebody else. So they'll feel more comfortable saying something that is kind of cultural, perhaps, or whatever to me, because they know that I know what it is. I feel like it allows you to break the ice in some ways.
Yes.
And allows them to feel a bit more maybe relaxed around you. So that's a huge positive, but at the same time there's loads of differences as well, and sometimes it can be a barrier, because you just don't know how they're, even though you're from the same place, quote unquote, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're representative of them, or that they feel that there's something in common, because to them I'm still a representative of, you know, this institution or whatever.
Yes, definitely. Times I find that when people know that you're from the same culture, regardless of differences, and it could swing both ways, that sometimes people do a good job of maintaining boundaries, but other times they can begin to sometimes overstep those boundaries because they assume that you can relate on that level, or that you I've had some experiences of people probably telling me too much about themselves than I felt was necessary to know in my professional capacity, just because we're from the same culture, or like making certain jokes, because again, within my culture, for example, we have that kind of like elderly and young person dynamics, that like you tend to call more people than you would like to aunties and uncles, but that happens. So I wasn't even calling this person an auntie and uncle, but that dynamic is there anyway, because I'm younger and they're older. So regardless of my professional abilities, that's just chucked in the bin for a second. But anyway, so this person started to tell me things, and I was like, I don't know how to respond to this. If I said it in English, like, all right, focus now, in the nicest possible and professional way, regardless of how I said it, because of that dynamics, they would have still taken offense to it. So it's just really weird, and it puts you in an uncomfortable place. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I can't be the only one.
No, you're not. I've had a few situations where, like, I have to sort of really switch on the professional sort of button, because I'll be like working with I'll like go and see a health visitor, and she ends up being a Ghanaian, and she's older than me, and I have to stop myself from calling her auntie, because I'm like, I don't know. There's so many times where I'm like, I'm gonna be like, auntie whatever. I'm like, no, I'm at work. I shouldn't be calling her auntie because I'm at work. But now I feel bad because she's obviously older than me, and I should obviously be calling her auntie, but I'm having to call her Judith or whatever. I don't know, it's just a bit, there's so many times where I'm like, this is, all these little things.
To you then, so when you go and call her by her name, how does she respond? Is she looking at you like, you didn't even call me auntie? Or
I think it depends. Like, it's so like sometimes-ish, if that makes sense. So there's certain people where sometimes it slips out. Sometimes it's just like, you know, without planning to, I'll end up saying it by accident. But I think they also understand the situation as well, that we're at work, so I'm going to call you your first name. But sometimes if I get quite close to them, then I feel even more pressure to be like polite. But I wouldn't do it in front of colleagues. Maybe it was just me and her or something. Perhaps. But it's just little awkward things where you're like, culturally, in this culture, in this work culture, we're equal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But actually, at the back of my mind, there's culture, and I'm like, oh, I should actually just be calling you auntie right now. Or like sometimes, like there's been times where I'll have like Nigerian parents or whatever, and then they make their kids call me auntie, which I don't mind. But then sometimes colleagues are like, why they're calling us auntie? And I'm like, yeah, it's just we're older, like that we're an older woman. They have to call us auntie.
You just reminded me, I've had that like on 2 occasions now, actually. Like, and I'm just like, it makes me really uncomfortable for these children, because they already have needs, like in terms of their speech, language, and communication needs. So if you're trying to teach them who an uncle and auntie is, but then they meet this total stranger. But sometimes I feel like I'm overthinking, because these children are usually fine with it. They're used to it now. Just like, bye, auntie. I'm like,
bye, auntie.
Like I've had parents like sometimes say to me, oh, give auntie a big hug.
Yeah.
I'm like, no.
I've had that as well. And I don't know what to say. I'm just like, oh. Oh.
Yeah.
It's just like the sort of where those things meet. It's awkward, but it's good at the same time. It's like sweet and sour.
Exactly. Because on one hand, you do feel like you feel really good that these people feel comfortable around you, enough to show. And like you said, Aradna, before, about like the openness, that sometimes you get a whole lot more out of people just because they spot similarities. But other times it can be a barrier as well, because then I think people worry about what will get back to the community, even though you may not necessarily know them from anywhere. But I think there's that element of not trusting people that look like you sometimes, based on history, personal experience, whatever it is. So it can be, like you said, sweet and sour experience, where some are like very forthright with what they share with you. They're very open. Sometimes some don't know the boundaries, and at other times some are just like, no, I'm not talking to her for whatever reasons, but it's there. It's really interesting.
I was just, as you was talking, I was remembering actually, when I worked in mainstream schools, there was a child that I saw who's also Black, and he was quite it's primary school, so he's primary school aged, and he had an older brother who was my age, and who he spent a lot of time with and things, and I could see that he could relate to me a bit better, maybe because of my age and the fact that I'm Black, and I felt that he really he relaxed a bit over time. Like he didn't want to attend therapy sessions often, but he did come and he did relax. I could kind of talk him around. But yeah, I just found that was really interesting, and just seeing how he kind of relaxed into the sessions a bit more. So I do think even age can play an impact on things, as well as race as well.
Yeah, and culture. I think anything that people feel that they can relate to you on helps them to relax. And that's why I feel like sometimes, like, how do I phrase this? So it is important for us to be representative and all of that stuff. But obviously sometimes there isn't going to be someone from quote unquote the community. And sometimes you'll get somebody quote unquote from the community, but actually they're not representative of the person that you're, you know, talking to, you know, for various reasons. So I feel like there is this skill that we all need to have to be able to find that common ground with people and make them know that you do respect where they're coming from. Like you can kind of tap into that sort of cultural or whatever it is space, and use that to help them relax. Because, you know, I'm like I said, I'm Ghanaian or whatever. I'm not from, I don't know, Jordan. But that doesn't mean that I can't work with a family who come from Jordan. I just need to have that sort of cultural awareness and cultural competence, and start to, you know, have that rapport with them and find what's meaningful for them and try and incorporate it that way and learn myself as well, which is easy to say in all these, you know, nice sentences. But actually, obviously, in real life, it can be a bit tricky. But I say all that to say that it is possible for people who are not from the culture to actually relate to somebody in that culture just by taking a few, you know, small steps, or just trying to understand them, or trying to understand what's meaningful to them as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you really hit the nail on the head by saying just trying to learn, so being open to learn,
definitely,
and not generalizing all the same time, because actually even from my perspective, sometimes I do feel like I am the spokesperson for all Black people, you know. You know, if there is a Black patient, for example, or a Black colleague, and something's going on, then they'll come to me and say, oh, you know, is this offensive? And it's like, well, you know, certain times I can't answer, because actually, you know, there are cultural differences within the Black community.
of
You know,
course.
there's differences, as you said, for me, within countries. There's Caribbeans, there's also Africans, but then there's different countries in Africa, there's different countries in the Caribbean, there's different cultures within those countries as well.
Exactly.
So I feel like you can't really generalize, but I feel like being a minority, you do feel like you are the voice.
Yeah, you end up being the voice, like it's inevitable, like
and
somehow.
I think sometimes it's positive, because for me, sometimes I feel that there are certain things that I can say, oh, actually, you know, from maybe some of my friends and things that I've observed, I can say, oh yeah, actually, it could be this, but I'm not saying it is. These are things to consider. You know, it could be this, it could be that, but I'm not saying it absolutely is, because I'm not that person. I don't know. But yeah, I think it is just important that, you know, we don't feel the pressure of having to know the answers all the time. We're able to say, I don't actually know.
Sometimes we're the same level of an outsider as you, who's not even from a minority. Sometimes, I mean, it's not that often, but there are cases where you're also the outsider.
And sometimes even more of an outsider, because interestingly, like I've met some people of a different culture. Now on the surface, like you see them or you hear where they're from and you assume that they don't know certain things, but they may have lived within a certain culture for so long. I've heard it a few times, that both in my professional role as well as just in general everyday life, like even slip-ups, like speaking Yoruba next to a white person just because you think they can't understand, and then they turn around to you and they actually understand. If that makes sense. They might be able to, like, if they, especially if they still live within that culture, there are lots of things that they probably know more than you who's not lived within that culture for a number of times. So it's just like, yeah, you at some, like, I think the point I'm making with that is the fact that you could be even more of an outsider than someone who's not from the same culture, just because they've kept up.
They've made the effort.
Exactly, they've made the effort. That's the key point. They've made the effort. Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny. I find it really funny that it's not just me that has that anti-dilemma.
No, like I've experienced it in not just in speech and language and working with like different people, but even like in other jobs I've had before this, like to the point where someone was expecting it. So we were working in a professional capacity, but she was expecting me to call her an auntie at work. I was like, no. It did cause a lot of friction, but I'm sure she survived somehow.
Oh gosh, it's so funny.
It is
hilarious.
I think this is a really important topic, and I think I remember, just to kind of like think about when I started speech and language therapy, and probably even before, I thought, oh, because I'm going to be like one of the minorities doing this course, it might just mean that obviously within the culture that people might like feel more comfortable talking with me, but that assumption has been well challenged just by actually doing it and working. Did you guys feel like you thought the same before you started, or actually you just worked with whatever you got?
I think, yeah, I think I just sort of worked with what I had, and also where I started working, it wasn't very diverse anyway. So when I did see families from an African background or a West African background, it was really like, oh wow, like, you know, and I don't think I thought about it as much as I do now. I wish I had thought about it a bit more, but I just feel like whenever I did, I don't know, I just felt an extra level of responsibility for certain things, especially if they told me something that is cultural and can be misunderstood. I always felt like, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to explain this for people to understand so they don't get in trouble? Like, they don't, like, obviously, like, you know, like when we spoke to Michelle, you know, abuse is abuse. I'm not talking about abuse. I'm talking about just cultural differences. Even in the way that families talk to their children, or expect them to do, or even the thing of like, say bye to auntie. Like some people will be like, that's a bit much. Like, why are you getting them to call a complete stranger auntie? But obviously I know why they're saying it, because it's just it's a norm, a cultural norm. In not only like obviously a lot of Asian communities, they have a similar thing as well. So yeah, I always felt just that level of responsibility to try and translate the message and the culture well. But it's, yeah, and it's a lot because there wasn't anyone to talk to about it. And I feel like that there is a need to be able to talk these things through with other people. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that I need to have a group of Ghanaian therapists and we all talk about seeing Ghanaian people in the UK. I just mean like some sort of forum to talk about cultural competencies, awareness, all of that stuff, and tease out these things so that you're able to make better judgments. Because yeah, like even when I just remembered one, and I remember it's just like, it was like something heavy on my heart or something. I was just like, when I was writing my notes, I was like, how am I going to write this? Like, if someone reads this, what I don't, like, I can see, especially because it was someone who was new to the country, just, you know, had come from Nigeria for not long ago. So the way she was describing things, or the way she was explaining things, was something that others would misunderstand. At the same time, I know that I could also be reading lots of things into what she's saying as well that is not there. You know, I need to include that as well. So I just, yeah, I found that really tricky. I found that really, and there wasn't anyone to sort of discuss it with. So I had to just sort of go with my gut and keep talking to her and being like, oh, you know, there's this, and you know, in this country there's this, like, that's how I tended to sort of go around it. Like, in this country, what they can do is this, or in this country, when they say this, they mean, like, that sort of approach. But sometimes I didn't like that either. Sometimes that felt like not the right thing. I don't know. It's just it's a really funny position to be in. It's a position of privilege, and you know, it's a good thing. It's an asset, or whatever you want to call it. But there's also so much that comes with it that you just kind of just try and manage on your own. But actually, it'd be good to talk about more.
Definitely, I can definitely relate to that. Like, it's just like sometimes, like, just a classic example actually, and I think we've kind of talked about this briefly in another episode. I might be wrong, maybe it's just our general chit chat. But how sometimes a child might come in and they're a bit subdued in the session. So you know how you're doing therapy and some children are very, and this is not even a cultural thing, but I've noticed it more with probably children from a similar culture sometimes, that they're a bit more subdued because of that adult-child dynamic, and how they aren't always, especially like if parents are kind of newish to the country, that sometimes the children don't talk as much in the presence of adults, because there's that dynamic of children are seen, not heard. And that can impact on therapy sessions, or like sometimes where I'm working with a really young child, and again, this is not even just the like Yoruba or Nigerian culture, I've also seen it like with some of the Asian families I've worked with, where parents have said to me, I don't have time to sit down with this child and play games with them, because in that culture, that's not what they do. Like, they don't tend to sit down. And I think I was reading a piece of research on that, actually. I think it was talking about like recently we did a talk on bilingualism at my workplace, and I think this was a piece of best practice paper that Sean Pert had done for the RCSLT, and I was talking about how like usually there's sometimes we want to go for a parent-child interaction sort of approach for a family, but that might not be an acceptable or like the best approach, whereas more directive therapy might work more for that family, because they don't PCI in their everyday life. A child is just put in front of a laptop or whatever, they get on with their work. And it's not laziness or anything, it's just the fact that, well, I learned somehow, that child's going to learn somehow, like whatever else is going on. I can't speak to that. But yeah, it's really, really about thinking about those cultures and finding ways to actually make it work for them.
Yeah, and I think I've had that, because I had that sort of situation where after, like, the parent was kind enough to do the therapy that I don't know if kind enough is the right word, but the parent, you know, decided to do the therapy that we agreed on. But even sometimes whilst during the therapy or after the therapy, I was just thinking, is this correct? Because these things are based on Western understandings of play and language and whatever. But because you're so new to the profession, because you don't really know necessarily that much, you might have these thoughts, but you just don't know what to do about it. At the same time, sometimes it's nice for people to try something different, because it's so, you know, there's so many different ways around it, or ways to see it. So yeah, I think it's something that's ongoing, and actually we need to kind of think about a lot more. And I'd love to read that research that you were saying about Sean Pert's one, because it's so true. Like, you can't just plaster something on everybody, but you also can't assume that they do not want to do it, or they won't do it, because like you say, culture changes, things move on. You know, people do sometimes decide that they want to ascribe to the culture that they're in, whatever your thoughts are about that, whether you think it's right or wrong. Sometimes that's the decision that they've made. Sometimes even if they've grown up in another culture, sometimes their cultural norm in that place was a Western norm. So, you know, I feel like we say this all the time, but it's just basically, you can't assume.
No.
You just have to go on a person by person basis, and sort of reflect on these things, be aware of them, but don't make them a rule book, because you know, like we said, it's not that straightforward, it's not that simple.
No, exactly. And I just exactly everything you said, I was just about to say as well, that it is about considering everyone as an individual and looking at what is going to be effective for that individual child or that individual adult that you might be working with, or that family that you're working. What is realistic to achieve? And I think as therapists, sometimes it's very easy to get caught up in just doing the same things or recommending what is comfortable without really taking the time to think about, okay, what is important for this child and what is important for this family at this time, and what is realistic and achievable for them? How can we tailor it to their culture and their needs as well, rather than, I guess, putting forward what is, I guess, the norm. And I think there needs to be more research into it, to be honest, because I don't think there is enough research out there about different types of therapy approaches for some cultures. I think there are research papers out there for other cultures, but I'm not sure about particularly, I don't know, West African, Caribbean cultures. I don't think there is that much out there.
No.
So I think that there's work that needs to be done in order to make this possible. But I think it's good to start having the conversation and start actually thinking about this, so that when we do go to work and we are working with these families, that we are more aware of these differences, and maybe start challenging our own thoughts around things as well.
I just remembered a piece of, I think it was a research that you'd seen, Aradna, that you shared with us as professionals as well. There is a culture within our profession, isn't it, that we are kind of indoctrinated into. Because sometimes as well, like we're familiar with the culture, like from like our home or our background, but also like because of our studies, we've also been indoctrinated into a culture, a way of thinking within our profession that sometimes conflicts with our home culture. So there's certain things that I'm sure if I didn't do speech and language therapy, I will probably be fine with, or that I might not think too much of, if that makes sense. But because I've done speech and language therapy, I've worked within the health, think about safeguarding and all of that. Like there's certain things I hear that just makes my antennas pop because I'm like, should that be happening? Whereas if I like, even if it's not someone I work with, I just overhear a conversation, or I'm a party or a gathering and I see things happening, that hat doesn't go off, if that makes sense. It's probably like dialed down, but that's still there somewhere. And if I kind of mention to my siblings who don't work in health, like healthcare, for example, I said, did you find that awkward? They're like, no, that's normal. And whereas I'm like, I'm not sure. So it's just really interesting. Yeah,
it is interesting, and it's not that you know, the information that's currently out there is not right. I just think it's about considering people as individuals and working from there, really. But I think we've had quite a good discussion today, and I'm just thinking about, you know, going forward then, what could be done.
I really feel that there needs to be some sort of, like what I was saying in the beginning, there needs to be some sort of space or forum to talk about these things more. Because like I said, I don't want there to be a thing of you have to see people who come from the same place as you, because you know, that's not what we're going for. But it's just, I think there needs to be more training in cultural competency to allow all of us to be able to, you know, meaningfully and appropriately adapting our therapy and our work to meet the needs of people, so that they don't have to cut off their culture or pretend to do something around us, or feel kind of awkward about something, or, you know, what they say is misunderstood kind of thing. But like, in order for that to happen, like, you need the training. And I don't think it's like a one-off, here's what cultural competency is training. Like, no, it's just like an ongoing conversation. Like, you know, like when we were talking to Michelle, like, let's actually have a conversation about these things. You know, this is my knowledge of Caribbean culture, or this is my knowledge of whatever, acknowledging that it changes. You know, this is a case that happened. What do we think? Like, how can we adapt this? Like, all of these things. I think that would be helpful, and it just needs to be ongoing, especially because we haven't really done this before, I think, as a profession.
No.
I think it's been like talked about here and there, but not consistently, like, you know, let's actually consider this frequently. And also, let's also talk about our culture and the fact, even if people don't come from a different like cultural background in terms of the country that they come from, the culture there, even in terms of the health culture and things that you assume that people understand, and it's an unsaid rule and all of this, and they don't.
Yes.
And they're too worried to say it because they don't want to look a certain way, or they don't want to look like they don't understand, or they don't know that they're allowed to ask questions, or, you know, all of that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's just more more space to discuss and think about these things and try and implement it.
Yeah.
Really good. But
you make really good and valid points, Arab, and I really like in terms of like carving spaces for people to have this conversation, because whether we like it or not, our society is going to continue to be diverse in ways that we probably can understand at this present time. Diversity in many ways, not just in terms of race, is probably only going to continue and evolve, might I add. I think whilst you're saying that, I remember that one of my colleagues, a brilliant colleague actually, I would add, she found out that the RCSLT they have people you can speak to about language norms in different cultures. I didn't know that.
Wow, that's brilliant.
So
I've never heard of that before. Wow.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you can call the RCSLT if you're concerned about language norms and all that kind of stuff about like for a child, and they'll be able to give you advice. But what I don't know if there is also cultural norms discussed as part of that conversation, because that gives you a bigger picture, if that makes sense. So on one hand, you can get the language norms. You might also be able to get some information on cultural norms. But I think also another way to probably improve on that and probably make it better is that, like, for there to be at least a bit more evidence about consultation with representatives, or at least people from those cultures, having those, like, do you understand, consulting with them, having those open conversations, releasing that information into the public sphere, like where we can find them, all that kind of stuff. I think that would work really well hand in hand with what you said, Arabna.
Yeah, I think it will work well, because the thing that I'm really wary about is things turning into tick boxes. Like, they're from, to use Ghana again, they're from Ghana, and these are the cultural norms in Ghana. But going back to the beginning of the conversation, it's not that straightforward.
No.
So that's what we were saying about, you have to take a very individual approach. But I think that if you have that thing in your head of sort of cultural respect, hopefully it will support. And it's something that we're all working on. I'm working on it. Well, I'm not working clinically at the moment, so when I go back to full-time clinical work, it's something to think about and to kind of see if I'm actually practicing what I'm preaching, because we're all guilty of these things as well, because these things kind of, but I think if we at least have that time and space and just access to information, like, why isn't that the fact that I didn't even know that the RCSLT did that needs to be like sounded loudly to say we do this also.
To be honest, I didn't, and neither did a lot of my colleagues at that meeting. Actually, we're all like kind of like, oh wow, that's interesting, I didn't know that. So again, it's great it's there, but obviously we're not utilizing it if a lot of us don't know about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, just to say, I agree with everything that both of you have suggested in terms of moving forward and what things could happen. And I absolutely think that training is necessary. I think in addition to what's been said already, just thinking about training actually for teams around how to be professionally curious. So knowing how to find out about cultures in a sensitive way, what kind of questions to ask, how to ask the questions, how to create a space where clients feel comfortable to share why they're deciding not to follow a particular recommendation, or having a space to actually share their personal experiences as being service users. I think that could be really helpful, just having like groups which is facilitated by someone in the trust, I don't know, someone where parents' voices can really be heard, and they can say, look, this is something that I've experienced, and this is something that for me worked well, or this is something that for me didn't quite work well. And actually, I would have liked my culture to have been considered in this way, or I would have liked to, be asked my opinion about this, rather than immediately referred to social care or something, I think it's good to have those opportunities as well. But yeah, I'm really hoping that, going forward, we will start to see some change in some of these areas. But I think we have the conversation. I think it's really good to have the conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
No, I agree.
On today's episode of the Listening Podcast, we shared our thoughts and experiences on being cultural insiders and outsiders, aka the double-edged sword with its different pros and cons. And as always, we shared some tips and ideas on how to move forward. It will be lovely to hear your thoughts and experiences as well, so feel free to drop a comment or send us a message on our social media pages or via email. Until next time, bye!